She adjusted the lace at her collar, as if a final smoothing of fabric could steady the room inside her. The chapel smelled of lilies and beeswax. Sunlight sliced through stained glass and feathered across the ivory of her dress. Guests leaned forward in expectant hush. Somewhere behind the organ, a string quartet breathed the last of a phrase. Beatriz Cardoso held the weight of her future in her hands, bouquet heavy with garden roses, a ring pressed under tissue in a satin box in her clutch, and then watched the world she had been building for years fall in a single breath. He was gone. Not because he had been struck by conscience or called away by an emergency. He had simply walked out, and beside him, laughing too loudly for the solemnity of the moment, was Marina. Marina, who had braided the bride's hair at dawn, who had corrected the seating chart and folded the napkins like origami. Marina, who had been the one to tell Beatrice months ago that love was patient, that mistakes could be mended. Marina, who now clutched Felipe's hand and ran. A sound detonated in the church, 200 stunned people, and the brittle clink of crystal in the reception hall. The bouquet slipped from Beatrice's fingers and tumbled down the aisle, petals scattering like small, helpless promises. Her father's face grayed, her mother's lips opened and closed without breath. Flashlight-shaped cameras of cell phones blinked suddenly to life. Someone screamed, or perhaps only whispered. The air seemed to thicken into the color of shame. Beatrice felt the veil as if it were a membrane separating the person she had been all morning from whoever she would become after the stain of that moment. The lace, the trained seam, the tiny, precise stitches she had once admired in a design book, now they felt ridiculous, ornamental armor with a crack in it. Her knees did not give out. She did not faint, as stories often promised. Instead, she stepped backward, stunned into motion by the need to see truth with her own eyes. Felipe and Marina disappeared through the side door under the chatter of 1,000 disbelieving tongues. It would have been easy to be described purely by that instant. The abandoned bride, the viral photograph with petals caught midair, 1,000,000 sympathetic captions. Newspapers would later sum the scene into a headline and a color photo. But that collapse had roots, in a life built on labor, on a series of careful designs, on choices that had once felt like the laying of foundation stones. To understand why that single runaway became an earthquake, one had to trace the blueprint back. Beatrice grew up in a narrow apartment above a paper shop in São Mateus, a place where paper was not merely stock but inheritance. Her parents, Seu Antonio and Dona Marisa, ran the shop with hands calloused from years of folding envelopes and gluing corners. They taught Beatrice how to corner a sheet so it wouldn't wrinkle, how to keep a hand steady when cutting.
She learned geometry before she learned gossip. Angles, load-bearing concepts, the quiet joy of two lines meeting and creating a plan. When she was 12, she found an old architecture magazine behind a stack of calendars and pressed her face to the photographs as if they were windows into another life. She read floor plans like people read letters. A scholarship changed everything. At 20, with a backpack patched at the seams and a stack of notebooks bursting with drawings, Beatrice enrolled in a public university and began to translate her childhood lessons into professional language. She moved through studios and critiques like someone rehearsing the politics of space, how light can soften a corridor, how a balcony can become a refuge. Her professors noticed the way she thought in layers, form, then function, then memory. Her designs often married austerity and warmth. They carried the practical stamp of someone who had learned that architecture must hold both rain and a family's secrets. Felipe Tavares appeared in one of those studios the way wealth appears in places where it has not yet been invited. Unmistakable, slightly intrusive. He was 27, groomed with money's confidence, and when he smiled, people assumed he had nothing left to prove. He had been introduced as a patron's son, a man who knew developers and dinner parties and could pull permits with a phone call. He lingered after a lecture, spoke with a casual admiration that Beatrice felt seen, and for the first time in public rooms of critique and competition, a little unafraid. He liked her sketches, not the way a client likes a product, but the way a man likes a secret. He would slide an espresso across a cafe table and tell her that her lines looked like people's homecomings. Their romance moved at the velocity of privilege, fast, glossy, everyone impressed. Rings were selected in afternoons of polished display cases. Dinners happened at rooftop restaurants where servers moved like music. The city below was meaningless in those moments because Felipe could pay to make the world small and perfectly ordered. For Beatriz, who had always measured worth by hours of labor and sketches crumpled and redrawn into beauty, the relationship offered a dizzying translation. Her designs were admired, her name repeated among a room of people who could turn her projects into something bigger than mere blueprints. But beneath the champagne and photographs, there were gaps. Felipe answered phones in another room. He left for business trips whose calendars remained opaque. He grew moody in ways that did not fit with the easy charm he displayed in public. Marina was there in the margins, Beatriz's oldest friend, the person who shared studio jokes and coffee spoons. Marina had a flair for finishing other people's sentences, an appetite for attention that Beatriz had once indulged with sisterly generosity.
She had helped Beatriz secure a small commission for a cultural center, and later, when that client became crucial to Beatriz's early reputation, Marina was first to congratulate her. She smiled like a partner, and in the quiet hours, Beatriz told herself that friendship was the kind of anchor you could rely upon. Small red flags were like hairline fractures in a wall. They did not demand immediate attention until the structure's stability faltered. Felipe's compliments sometimes had an edge, as if he were recalibrating Beatriz's achievements into anecdotes that made him look like the generous beneficer. Marina, for her part, began to linger in conversations about Beatriz's work with a tone that shifted from curiosity to ownership. She would quote a paragraph from Beatriz's presentation as if it had been hers, or offer an edited drawing with an air of "we should have done this" that left Beatriz either flattered or quietly annoyed. Once, at a late-night studio session, Marina laughed and said, "You don't need to be so humble all the time. Your work has to be seen in the right rooms." Beatriz had smiled, because friends say things like that to bolster, and because Beatriz believed, stubbornly, in making room for people. The wedding preparations accelerated. Beatriz designed the invites herself, choosing paper from her parents' shop for the envelopes, crafting the seating with the same care she gave to a small public library. There was a rehearsal at the chapel with white candles and a conductor counting time, and Beatriz practiced looking steady for photographs. Her parents watched, proud and trembling. The Tavares family, large and impeccable and perfectly coordinated, arrived in a black car constellation. Helena Tavares, the matriarch, wore a brooch like a small family crest and a circuit of smiles that had been practiced for decades. Roberto, stern and formal in public and privately a man who preferred to assess a project's foundations, offered compliments on Beatriz's taste. He asked her questions at dinner about load-bearing walls in the city's new low-income housing project, and in that way hinted at respect, speaking of architecture as if it could be a bridge between worlds. Still, there were moments that made Beatriz pause. Felipe once tucked a stray hair behind her ear in a restaurant and said, sotto voce, that she should be grateful for opportunities he could introduce. He loved her claims to humility because they made him look consequential. Marina's laughter sometimes filled rooms and left Beatriz holding the quieter parts of herself. Yet Beatriz kept drawing, kept planning, finding in the work a refuge from the social calculus that always tilted toward power. Then, in a single breath that would be photographed and replayed until the faces in the images became public property, the altar scene happened. The images, Beatriz's back to the nave, the falling bouquet, Felipe's silhouette moving toward the side door with Marina pressed close, spread like a torn pattern across feeds and front pages. People offered simplistic narratives, cowardice, betrayal, melodrama. But Beatriz lived inside the moment in a texture richer than tabloid headlines. The focus of 200 eyes, the taste of metallic panic in her mouth, the clinical observation of a seamstress's hands trembling at the hem. When the crowd's murmur swelled into gossip, the immediate aftermath resembled a physical wound. Clients called to cancel meetings, nervous that the association with scandal would stain their brands. A magazine editor who had promised an interview delayed it indefinitely. Invitations to smaller, exploratory commissions stopped arriving. The world that had promised entry under Felipe's apparent umbrella retreated as if a storm had passed. If the runaway had been the first woe, it was only the beginning. In the days that followed, Beatriz discovered that betrayal had multiple faces. It was not just the public humiliation, it was the cold calculus that fetched its own kinds of wounds, the theft of trust within her professional life, the slow leaching away of the work she had labored over while sleeping too little and drinking coffee too strong, in a studio that stayed open when the streetlights dimmed. The first time she suspected this,
It was over an email that should have been an ordinary message from a client asking for an updated project schedule. The link opened a document that read like an echo of her thesis, the same modular unit she had proposed for low-cost housing, the same courtyard solution for communal circulation, redrawn with subtle changes and presented under a different name. At first, Beatriz told herself she was imagining things. Ideas refract in a city, parallel thinking happens. But then she found a tender she had placed months ago, an internal note from an assistant who had left to join a rival firm, lines of her own precise phrasing, the same unique detail about balcony thresholds, credited to someone else. Small items, the precise way she folded a plan for presentation, a unique schematic for cross-ventilation, appeared in brochures that bore Felipe's clients' logos or were announced under Marina's consultancy firm name, patterns crystallized like frost on glass. Anger arrived layered beneath hurt. It was not the burning vindictiveness of revenge as fiction often glorifies. It was a specific, practical outrage at theft. Beatriz understood plagiarism as a structural violation, the removal of bearing walls from a building and passing it off as a new construction. This was about work being taken, credit removed, identity erased from the plans she had annotated and the nights she had spent correcting the calculations.
She began to collect evidence as a person collects the necessary parts of a case, copies of submissions, dated emails, drafts bearing her watermark or her handwriting. She sat in her parents' small kitchen late at night and found that she could still trace, in the ink of margin notes, the rhythm of her own thoughts. The handwriting looked like testimony. She kept a record on her laptop, a careful chronology that would not be swayed by public gossip or private intimidation. Confrontations followed, but not at first with Felipe. She confronted Marina in the studio where they had once toasted each other's success. They had been drinking water, and Marina's perfumed presence seemed excessive for such a small room. Beatriz asked calmly for answers. Marina's smile turned quickly into a different instrument, defensiveness, then anger. "You're making this dramatic," Marina said. "You think I'd need to steal from you? I helped you. I helped you get access. Think." Beatriz held the folder between her hands like a piece of evidence in a courtroom. "These drafts have my notes, Marina. These emails are from the clients who hired me. How do you explain the portfolio that's now under your name?" Marina's jaw tightened. She said, "People share work in this business. This city runs on favors and introductions. You of all people know that." The conversation left Beatriz colder than the winter air. It was not the accusation that hurt so much as the effrontery, the suggestion that her work had been part of a communal pool, that the precise scrawl of her marginalia was not a signature, but a negotiable asset. It forced Beatriz into the vocation she had trained for. She became in that moment not merely an architect, but a litigator of truth. News outlets, rightly always hungry for images, did what they do. They fanned suspicion into accusation. A magazine column speculated that Felipe had been gambling with family accounts. Another offered a salacious interpretation that linked the runway to some imagined web of motives. Social media invented narratives that meant nothing, and yet shaped everything. For Beatriz, the fall was not only personal, it was professional, like a roof leak that spread mold into the beams. That was when Dr. Carlos Mendez arrived. He did not come with theatricalism. He came with a folder, a practical man whose voice had the agreeable timbre of someone used to translating complexity into action. He had been an ally to the Cardoso family in small ways before, an awkward handshake at a fundraiser, a letter of reference for a scholarship. But now he knocked at Beatriz's door in the soft hour between night and morning, carrying the kind of attention that disrupts sleep. "Miss Cardoso," he said, the name said with a respect that felt like a small mercy. "I can't pretend to be unaffected by what happened at the chapel, but that is not why I am here. We need to talk about your work." He spoke of audits and forensic accounting and shell companies in a tone that was neither sensational nor clinical. It was the tone of someone who had seen patterns before and wanted to map them. He had papers, copies of bank transfers, snapshots of company records that showed a route of funds that did not add up, and crucially, digital metadata, timestamps on files that matched the moments when Beatriz had been submitting her work for review. He pointed to emails with headers that bore the signature of Marina's consultancy firm, but with the author field listing email addresses linked to Felipe's accounts. There were transfers labeled as consulting fees, routed through a network of small firms and then consolidated into accounts under names Beatriz did not recognize. Each line in the spreadsheets was a small revelation. Each number translated a betrayal into something legible. When Dr. Carlos said the word embezzlement, Beatriz flinched. There are words that make architecture feel suddenly childish. And when he mentioned forensic evidence, she felt the gravity of her reality settle. It was no longer a private pain. It had become a corporate problem with legal teeth, a public scandal that demanded reconstruction as meticulous as any building plan she had ever drawn. Felipe's name on a ledger felt obscene. Marina's smile in the ledger's email chain felt perverse. The Tavares family's signature on some transfer invoked images of a system that had long tolerated the small thefts of privilege and now had the gall to expect silence from those they harmed. Beatriz looked at the papers and felt a fierce solitude that no sympathetic headline could remedy. Her first instinct, raw and human, was to demand retribution. The word revenge hovered in the air of several conversations she found herself having in the weeks after the chapel. Friends whispered it like an offering. Strangers suggested it as a television plot. But Beatriz's anger was not a weapon to terrify. It was a mechanism to reclaim what had been taken. She did not want to pulverize lives for spectacle. She wanted accountability, time-stamped and public, and she wanted the right to continue building things without her name being a commodity traded for lunches and favors. There were practical steps to take. Dr. Carlos recommended that she gather everything she could that proved authorship: original files, raw sketches, notes on napkins she'd kept from client meetings. He told her about audit trails and how digital timestamps could tell the story of creation more faithfully than a crowded room. He suggested that they engage a firm for a forensic accounting review, someone who could follow the money without being seduced by the glamour of the Tavares name. He was careful with language about charges and convictions. He said investigation often, the way one repeats a prayer to keep oneself from making promises one cannot keep.
Beatriz listened and said, as she always did when invited into a new plan, "Show me what to do." There were other intimacies to navigate. Roberto Tavares, who had been polite and distant in the early months of their acquaintance, reached out with a card and a handwritten note that expressed regret for his son's behavior without taking responsibility for the family's failings. He called Beatriz into his office one afternoon, a room that smelled faintly of old wood and expensive books, and for the first time he did something that altered the narrative. He listened. "I have always believed in good work," he said, quietly. "Your designs were admired in my circle." Beatriz kept her answers measured. She did not want pity or flattery. She wanted truth. She was not interested in being consoled by phrases that smoothed reputations. She wanted the theft acknowledged and rectified. Roberto, for his part, seemed surprised by the simple moral calculus of restitution. That surprise was telling. He was not a monster. He was a man who had been raised to believe loyalty to family could sometimes override the law. He had lived much of his life in the soft assumption that his decisions were both private and omnipotent. Helena moved like a shadow across the scene. Her influence was the kind that guided rumors into specific shapes. She paid compliments to journalists and sent polite notes to patrons, all while arranging for damage control in ways that smelled of a careful gardener pruning flowers. There were conversations where her voice took on the thin tone of strategic morbidity: how best to limit scandal, how to manage a son with appetites that could be corrected with appearances and donations. She had a knack for rearranging blame into manageable increments. Beatriz's parents, meanwhile, stood in the kitchen of their small apartment and watched their daughter hold these invaders to account. They had the humility and stubbornness that come from a life of keeping a business alive by servicing a neighborhood's constant needs. Their love was not grandiloquent. It was practical: a pot of soup waiting, a towel flung across a chair, a quiet insistence that paperwork be organized and that testimony be saved. Word spread. Investors who once praised Beatriz's concept of affordable housing began to call their brokers. The city's press picked up the thread between the chapel's theatrics and the newly revealed discrepancies in public contracts rumored to have been influenced by the Tavares group. In the court of public opinion, the family's name was being tested. In the ledger of real money, accounts were being scrutinized. The scandal had moved from bridal catastrophe into structural corruption, from one man's abandonment to a network that had been siphoning credit, attention, and resources. In the quiet hours when she was no longer being called by journalists and when the screens of her phone dimmed, Beatriz would return to her sketchbooks.
She drew lines as if to reassert a bodily truth, that buildings could be designed to hold people together, not to divide them. Her pen moved with the confidence of someone who had been practicing this language since childhood. Designing, for her, was never just about form. It was a way to imagine a world where foundations could be trusted. And yet the world met her with a new set of challenges. Some friends suggested suing immediately. Others warned against the spectacle of pitting oneself against a powerful family. Dr. Carlos counseled patience and precision. "We build a case the way you would build an edifice," he told her, "one careful layer at a time. We don't knock down walls unnecessarily.
We place the evidence where it cannot be denied. The day Dr. Carlos presented a folder of documents that mapped transfers and metadata was the day the shock that began at the altar found its first legal echo. He did not promise immediate justice. He offered instead the slow clarity of proof, timestamps aligning with Beatriz's drafts, emails forwarding her proposals with alternative names inserted, shell entities that received payments described as consulting yet had no real business operations. It was no longer only a matter of false hearts and jealous friends. It was a pattern of monetary substitution and misattribution. Beatriz sat with those pages and felt something harden in her, not bitterness that would turn corrosive, but a resolve that could be described only as architectural, the intention to rebuild without the rotten beams. She looked at the handwriting on the edges of her original sketches, the margins where she had once penciled an idea so fleeting she almost discarded it. Those margins were her witness. When she left Dr. Carlos's office, there were cameras outside, though the legal team had tried to keep the meeting private. A reporter called her name like a curiosity. "Miss Cardoso, do you plan to press charges?" someone shouted, while a photographer adjusted a lens. Beatriz, who had learned to speak plainly at client presentations, answered in a voice that surprised even her. "I'm not looking to make a spectacle. I want the record to be clear. I want the work attributed correctly, and I want any funds moved unlawfully to be returned so they can serve the projects they were meant for." The camera flashed. The sentence became a headline in less than an hour. "Bride seeks truth, not spectacle." People parse the phrase the way people always parse anything that resists their own appetite for drama. Some praised her dignity. Others questioned her motives, offering whispers that perhaps she was on a social climb. But the effect of her words was not measured by praise. It was measured by the small movement of people who had once thought that privilege could erase accountability. The ledger had to be read, and a new narrative would be written, one that placed authorship back where it belonged.
That evening, alone in the small living room of her parents' apartment, Beatriz unfolded a sheet of tracing paper and placed it over a window of memory. She thought about the chapel, the way the light had struck the lace, and then about the way metal and money can dull a person's capacity for loyalty. She thought of Marina's early kindness, and then of the way envy sometimes wears the face of friendship. She thought of Felipe's easy smiles, and the way some people use charm like a ticket through doors they have no right to enter. Most of all, she thought of the architecture she wanted to create, buildings that could give dignity to those who had been ignored, places that would not be designed to signal status, but to serve. There were days of angry calls and nights of brittle silence. There were offers from strangers who wanted to help, and from acquaintances who wanted to capitalize on the scandal. There were also moments of tenderness, a neighbor who came with a casserole, a former professor who sent an encouraging note. But the structural work had begun. Dr. Carlos filed requests for formal audits. Forensic accountants were engaged to follow the money. The network of shell companies began to be mapped like a complex but solvable floor plan. Each new document felt to Beatriz like a structural element being shored up. Evidence was a kind of reinforcements bar. Truth could be supported with numbers and timestamps, the way a balcony is supported by cantilevers. And through all of this, a paradox emerged. The world that had tried to humble her in public was, in some strange sense, the very arena in which she could regain power. If the Tavares network wanted to operate in the market of influence, then she would use the same instruments: documentary proof, public accountability, and the quiet force of professional integrity to build a different kind of authority. She did not relish the spotlight. She relished the chance to make her work matter again, to ensure that roofs covered families who needed them, and that public funds served the common good. That night, as the city lights blinked and the paper shop below hummed through its late hours, she placed a small model of a housing module on the kitchen table. It looked modest against the clink of plates and the soft rattle of her parents' radio, but to Beatriz it resembled a small promise of restoration. She would not let her work be hollowed out by others. From across town, the Tavares family convened in a different kind of room, a lacquered conference hall where threats were evaluated and reputations were ensured. Helena paced, crisp as a cut cloth, while Roberto listened, and Felipe, increasingly secretive, made the kinds of calls that carried the hush of family strategizing. Marina, when she was present at social functions, smiled with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to being accepted. Their world believed in power as a solvent. Their instinct was to dissolve scandal with money, to buy goodwill or create distance until the public's gaze moved elsewhere. But processes had been set into motion that money alone could not easily reverse. Accounts were being traced, and witnesses began to emerge. A clerk who remembered an unusual check, a former employee who had seen documents handled in odd ways. Not all of these people were motivated by pure conscience. Some were motivated by the unsettling quiet of being collateral damage in a family's maneuvers. Yet their testimonies, when assembled, would form the scaffolding of an investigation that would not respect family prerogative simply because a surname wielded weight. As Beatriz prepared to face what came next, courtrooms she had never imagined entering, depositions, and the slow, tedious work of restoring credit to her name, she felt beneath it all the architecture of a decision forming. It was not a decision born of spite. It was a plan for a life that would not be diminished by other people's theft. She thought of the city and its need for projects she had once sketched in the margins, and she felt the pull of a different kind of success, one that carried responsibility as a load-bearing beam rather than ostentation as cladding. When Dr. Carlos left her with a stack of documents, he paused at the door. He did not offer platitudes. He said simply, "You asked for a strategy. We'll build it. But be prepared. People with power don't fold quietly." Beatriz looked through the window at the ribbon of streetlights, and for the first time since the chapel, the future felt like something she could map. She placed a ruler on the tracing paper and drew a straight line. The line ran from the chapel to the office of the forensic accountant, from the paper shop to a public housing site she had always wanted to build. It was a line of work and of truth. On her nightstand, the satin box with the ring remained unopened. The ring now represented more than broken romance. It was a relic of the life that had been promised to her, and she kept it not as a shrine, but as a token that reminded her of both loss and the possibility of reinvention. She would not be defined by abandonment. She would be defined by how she rebuilt. The investigation gathered momentum. A journalist who had once written only perfunctory lifestyle pieces began to probe, asking questions about links between certain public contracts and private transfers. A small, determined group of investors who believed in the social value of Beatriz's work offered to fund an independent review of the tender processes. The more people looked, the less clean the edges of the Tavares' empire became. And yet, power breeds countermeasures. The Tavares lawyers, subtle and practiced, replied to each assertion with an equal measure of legalese and denial.
Social pages ran features about communal misfortune and private pain, and the public's appetite for scandal alternated between pity and appetite for spectacle. In the din, Beatriz learned a new art, the art of holding an axis of purpose in a city that loved to tilt narratives into caricature. The next move, dolor and structure alike suggested, would not come from tabloids or family charm. It would come from documents, facts that could be held up, verified, and placed in the right hands. She had chosen Dr. Carlos because he did not invent drama. He organized it. The next morning, he called to set a meeting with auditors who had agreed to follow the money with no interest in the celebrity. When they gathered in a small room, the air tasted like paper and a faint trace of ink. The forensic accountant spoke in a voice that broke down complex flows into a sequence of obvious actions: transfer, consolidation, laundering through subcontractors, relabeling as consulting. It read like a construction plan rendered in illegal ink. Each movement had been deliberate. Each euphemism in the ledger had a purpose: to hide authorship and redirect funds. There were nights after that assembly where Beatriz woke and wrote down fragments of conversation she had had years before, as if the city itself were now a blueprint revealing hidden columns. She called a former student who had interned briefly at the Tavares firm and asked about file names. She emailed clients and asked that if they had received proposals to check for authorship markers. She and Dr. Carlos set up a small war room in a borrowed office, walls pinned with printouts, post-it flags fluttering like tiny construction markers. And then, as the papers accumulated and the financial flows clarified into a pattern more damning than the social gossip had suggested, an envelope arrived from a source who wished to remain anonymous. The envelope contained a printout of a message exchange, a single thread of text that, when read, made the betrayal palpably specific. Proposals that bore Beatriz's phrasing forwarded through channels linked to Marina, indicated with commentary from Felipe. It was not only that work had been taken, it was that her work had been made into currency. Beatriz read the printout in the small hours with a light on and the city muffled beyond the window. There was a precision in the arrangement of words that made it impossible to deny, timestamps that coincided with her submissions, headers that bore client names, a forwarding address in Felipe's domain that matched the route of funds. The betrayal that had been intimate and messy became under light and paper, precise and systemic. She sat back and for a moment allowed herself to simply feel, not to be theatrical. She had known too many people who used grief as performance, but to acknowledge the calibration of pain into determination. She no longer wanted a story of romantic loss to define her.
She wanted structures that could shelter the vulnerable, and a professional life that would not be pilfered by greed. Outside, life went on with a cruelty that felt both banal and profound. The Tavares family continued to attend galas. They continued to place op-eds. The city, as always, brewed scandal and forgetfulness in equal portions. Inside, among measuring tools and paper, Beatrice began to assemble a different kind of project, a legal strategy, a public campaign, and, underneath it all, a quietly radical plan to design affordable, dignified housing that would prove what her work could do when allowed to be itself. The architecture of her life would be rebuilt on a new foundation, accountability first, then construction. She prepared for the next steps with the steady cadence of someone who knew that building anything worth living in required patience. There would be hearings and interrogations, and the slow art of gathering witnesses. There would be the discomfort of public speculation and the moral complexity of seeing people she had known fall. But there would also be the possibility, real, measurable, of turning theft into opportunity for the community she came from. The first legal notice arrived as a thin callus over the open wound of the wedding day, a subpoena to testify before an investigatory committee, and a request for all related documentation. Beatrice answered with the professionalism of a woman who had long practiced presenting plans before skeptical boards. She did not seek revenge. She sought to translate damage into remedy. As she prepared to leave for the first hearing, she placed the satin box with the ring into a drawer and locked it. It was not an act of bitterness. It was an act of cataloging. The ring could be a relic, or it could be evidence. She would decide later. For now, there were lines to draw on paper and a city to design. Late that afternoon, as she walked to the car with a folder of documents pressed against her chest, a voice called from a nearby terrace. Roberto stood in the doorway, framed by a garden that Beatrice had once quietly admired in a gala program. He looked older in the close light, as if world-weary moments had carved 1,000 fine lines into a formerly untroubled surface. He raised his hand. "Miss Cardoso," he said, "may I speak with you for a moment?" She hesitated only because she calculated the optics, the father of the man who betrayed her calling for a private conversation. But she had become practiced in reading power and in turning it into leverage for truth. She nodded and stepped forward. Roberto's eyes were steady. "I want to understand," he began, "not because I am defending my family, but because I believe influence should be used to repair harm when possible." Beatrice looked at him, seeing in the quiet corners of his face a man who had perhaps never considered how his influence had been used as a curtain. She measured her words with the precision of a professional who knew that rhetoric can be part of a foundation. "Then help us make the record clear," she replied. "Help us make the money go back to the projects it was meant for. If influence can do that, then use it." Roberto considered her. There was something like a contract made in the space between two people when one said what they wanted plainly, and the other, perhaps reluctantly, agreed. He said, at last, "I'll see what I can do." Beatrice left the room with a sense of the world shifting on a hinge so small it might have gone unnoticed. The hinge was a conversation. She had not compromised her dignity. She had met power with a request for accountability. That, for now, would have to be enough. But stories like this do not conclude in a few polite notes and good intentions. They build, floor by floor, or they collapse. She tucked her documents back into the leather bag and drove home through a city that did not yet know what the next chapter would hold. The satellite lights of neighborhoods passed like stitches on the urban fabric. She thought of a model unit she had drawn months ago and imagined a family moving into a modest living room that actually worked for a mother, a tenant, a working man. She imagined a city where resources meant what they were supposed to mean. At the end of that day, with the sound of a late bus rattling past and the paper shop downstairs locking up, Beatrice folded the tracing paper over her hands and for the first time since the chapel, allowed herself a small smile, one not of triumph, but of readiness. The scandal had been caught in betrayal, but the betrayal had opened a path, however jagged, toward rebuilding. The next move would be public, brutal perhaps, and never simple. Dr. Carlos would call in the morning with the names of auditors. Journalists would keep asking for quotes. The Tavares family, with all its resources, would not yield quietly. And somewhere in those future pages, decisions bigger than one wedding would be made, about accountability, about restitution,
about whether someone whose work had been stolen could transform personal violation into structural change. The story had not yet reached its summit. It was only beginning to climb. When she turned off the lamp that night, the city outside was a field of tiny, steady lights. She lay awake long enough to know that the next day she would be summoned into a place of official papers and formal statements. She would be required to speak plainly about the theft of contracts and designs, about the small acts that had become a pattern, about a family's privilege that had been misapplied. She would do it, not because she wanted vengeance, but because she believed that a life, like a building, must sometimes be stripped to its frame to be made sound again. The alarm woke her before dawn. The folder was already packed. The ring, a small circle of possibility, remained in the drawer.
She closed the drawer, slid the key into her pocket, and opened a new folder labeled in her handwriting, Reconstruction. Morning arrived like a blueprint unrolled. Pale light, exact angles, a city that made sense again when measured. Beatriz picked up the folder labeled Reconstruction and carried it out into the day as if it were a set of plans for a life that might finally hold weight. There would be hearings, documents to notarize, witnesses to locate, but first came small, necessary things. A meeting with auditors, a press briefing that had to be given with care, and a private conversation with a man whose surname now sat at the center of everything he had once tried to hide. If this story has you hooked and you want the full timeline of how truth reshaped power, consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who loves dramatic, true story turns. The auditors arrived in a modest conference room that smelled of coffee and recycled paper. Their screens lit up with spreadsheets and maps of transfers. They traced payment routes through shell companies and found that genes of the same corrupt architecture repeated across accounts. Funds labeled as consulting, invoices without substance, and client lists that bore Beatriz's phrasing. Each trail they followed led inevitably to a cluster of names connected to the Tavares group. For Beatriz, each revelation was another concrete poured under a foundation. It did not ease the sting of betrayal, but it turned fury into work. She sat at one end of the table, precise in her questions, her pen moving across pages with the same steady hand that once detailed cross-ventilation in a studio model. Dr. Carlos sat beside her, translating legal possibilities into practical steps. The team advised careful public messaging, file the evidence, cooperate with authorities, avoid theatrics. Their work would be slow and relentless, the sort of process that respects detail over spectacle. The morning's momentum became midday's escalation. Headlines that had once fixated on the chapel's image now widened to include phrases like forensic accounting and conflict of interest. Investors demanded clarity. A municipal oversight committee requested documents. The Tavares lawyers struck back with careful denials and statements about ongoing inquiries, but the ledger's ink had a stubborn way of refusing the polish of crafted spin. When auditors asked for invoices and corroborating emails, systems returned time-stamped proof. When they subpoenaed internal memos, a trail of forwarded drafts showed up, annotated in ways only someone who had worked at night could recognize. Under pressure, fractures widened at the Tavares household. Helena, who had once arranged the family's affairs with the precision of an editor, found her control slipping. She attempted damage mitigation in public while privately demanding obedience from those around her.
At a private dinner meant to rally family loyalty, she made a miscalculation. She attempted to reach Beatriz with what she no doubt hoped would seem like magnanimity, an offer framed as compensation for discomfort, a sum and a suggestion that silence would smooth the path forward. Beatriz received the offer at a neutral venue, the silverware arranged like a row of small rectified windows. Patricia, present in a shawl of thin approval, spoke on Elena's behalf with the practiced voice of someone who had always negotiated favors for family. "We can make an arrangement," she said. "A donation to your institute, resources to continue your work. Why drag the name through mud?" The offer was currency wearing a smile. It was, to Beatriz, an attempt to convert apology into purchase. She felt the familiar architectural instinct enter her speech. Identify the load, refuse the rotten beam. She set the documents down. "I design buildings that shelter people," she said. "I do not want my work to be a ledger line in someone else's charity. If there are funds that should have gone to public projects, let them go where they were intended. I will not sign away authorship or forgiveness for money." They had expected outrage, perhaps pleading. Instead, they met a refusal that came without rancor. It was quiet and final in the way of someone who had already measured the cost. Roberto watched the exchange as if watching a plan unfold. For years, the patriarch had preferred to keep family disputes internal. He had believed until that moment that privilege could be contained, that loyalty could be purchased, that reputations could be preserved with the right allocation of favors.
But sitting across from Beatriz, listening to the plain terms she offered and the public accountability she demanded, something in him shifted. "I won't buy silence for my family's mistakes," Roberto said finally. It was not a grand pronouncement. It was a line drawn clearly on a table. "We will cooperate. We will see what must be returned." There are small, cinematic moments when a man's composure fractures and reveals what lies under. That evening at the dinner table, Roberto's steadying hand did not only protect him from headlines, it exposed a generational collision. Alina's mouth tightened. Patricia set her napkin down with the kind of care someone uses when they are losing a game. The household strategies, reassignment of blame, quiet payments, suppression, thinned like old paint. News of the family disagreement leaked naturally, and the city's appetite for drama found it irresistible. Yet while gossip feeds on spectacle, legal measures demanded patience. Investigators began to ask for staff lists, for contract logs, for the names of intermediaries who had received transfers labeled with euphemisms. Beatriz supplied what she had gathered: timestamps on files, drafts, contingency notes, and the memory of a hustle born out of a paper shop in São Mateus.
When the police made a move to question Felipe, the young man's guarded composure vanished. He had been practiced in charm, but charm did not translate into credible explanations for certain bank movements and forwarded documents. The investigation's language, charged, arrested, pending further inquiry, was careful, as legal proceedings must be. Yet for those paying attention, it signaled the moment when private misdeeds crossed into public consequence. Marina's professional standing crumbled in parallel. Professional associations that oversee accreditation and licensure could not ignore a pattern in which a consultant's portfolio bore the distinctive phrasing and problem-solving that Beatriz had provenly authored. Complaints were filed. An inquiry into academic and professional misconduct opened, and eventually the association suspended Marina's license pending formal findings. For Marina, the fall was not theatrical revenge. It was the loss of the professional identity she had built on borrowed drafts and manufactured opportunities. It forced a reckoning. How much of her rise had been authored by someone else's nights? Helena's health, always a fragile admixture of control and grandiosity, unraveled under scrutiny. As inquiries revealed transfers and contested accounts, she reacted in the way some people do when patterns they curated collapse, by tightening and then cracking. Medical professionals, after evaluation, recommended a period of treatment for conditions that had long been obfuscated by family power. She was diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder with paranoid traits, and clinicians recommended a structured therapeutic environment. The diagnosis was not a theatrical judgment. It was a clinical description used to explain behavior and a recommendation for care. Helena was admitted to a facility where she received treatment, and the household center of gravity shifted again. Patricia's role in smoothing deals and calling favors also came under scrutiny. Investigators asked questions about intermediaries, about who had coordinated certain contracts. Her involvement led to inquiries within the companies that had benefited from the redirected funds. She faced regulatory probes and potential charges tied to administrative complicity, an indictment that left the family's social fleet in disarray. Through all this, Beatriz's choices remained deliberate. She refused offers that reduced her to a bargaining chip. She insisted on public accounting rather than clandestine settlements. She could have chosen another path, settle quietly and continue to design, but she had learned to think in terms of structures that serve. She wanted something larger, not just restitution for herself, but the return of funds to projects they had been diverted from, and assurance that her work would be used to shelter those who needed it. Roberto did more than promise. Privately, he used his influence to open doors for auditors and to pressure elements in his network to cooperate. That cooperation was not simple or instantaneous. Family loyalties are knots that do not untie cleanly. There were arguments, whispered counsel, and some members who preferred legal defense over disclosure. But Roberto, perhaps chastened by seeing his son's choices in stark detail, chose a different line: to support restitution and to distance himself from those who had abused the power his name afforded. Then came the pivot that surprised nearly everyone, and that would later anchor tabloid lines and serious op-eds alike: an offer of partnership that began as something practical and became something intimate. It unfolded without theatrics, no sudden declarations or public spectacles, but with the same quietly rational cadence that had characterized Beatrice's life since childhood. In a small office filled with models and daylight, Roberto and Beatriz spoke not as a patriarch and a wronged party, but as two adults assessing shared futures. He had watched her rise from meticulous sketches to a public figure who demanded accountability. He admired the focus she brought to projects, the way she spoke to both the needs of a family and the demand of a city. He had been raised to defer to power, but now found himself wanting to redirect influence for public good. "I want to protect what you do," he said one afternoon, "not as a man who feels guilt, but as someone who believes your work should not be silenced. I can do things differently. I want to support the institute you envision, not with charity, but with structure." Beatriz listened, her default posture one of measured curiosity. The proposal could have been purely instrumental: use Roberto's name, secure funding, and give her work a platform. But she knew how offers like that could be framed and retracted. She required clarity, transparency, consent, and public accountability. She asked hard questions about governance, oversight, and how decisions would be made. Roberto responded with patience, agreeing to mechanisms that would prevent family control from overriding the institute's mission. There were board terms, fiduciary safeguards, and public disclosure clauses. The conversation moved beyond the personal to the institutional. Days later, at a small gathering intended to introduce the new institute board to potential donors and staff, the talk turned unexpectedly private. The room quieted into an intimate hush as Beatriz stepped forward, not to demand, not to admonish, rather to make a proposition that would recast the narrative of the ordeal. "I've been offered many kinds of help," she said, looking at Roberto, then at the assembled guests. "But what I want is a commitment, to restore what was taken and to ensure it never happens again."
If you are willing to stand with me, not as a benefactor who buys silence, but as a partner who builds structures to protect people, then I want to ask something personal and intentional. Roberto, would you marry me? The sentence landed with the same precise shock as a keystone being dropped into place. It was not impulsive. It was an extraordinary articulation of agency. For Beatriz, the question was less about romantic rescue than an explicit pact. Marriage understood as mutual responsibility, public affirmation, and a legal framework that would bind Roberto's influence to a new purpose. It would, she argued, make accountability more visible, make restitution easier to enforce, and provide an institutional cover that would protect her work. Roberto's initial astonishment gave way to a long, steadying breath. He had been married before. He had been a father who had failed in certain ways. The offer contained elements of restitution he had not anticipated. For him, it was not a gambit for control, but a chance at repair, both personal and structural. When he accepted, he did so with conditions Beatriz set: full transparency, joint oversight of the Institute, and a public statement acknowledging past failures and detailing restitution plans. He agreed to submit to oversight mechanisms that would be legally enforceable and to step back from unilateral control over contracts. Consent between them was explicit, negotiated, and public-facing. Friends and family reacted with mixed astonishment and criticism. There were whispers about power dynamics, about impropriety, about whether a bride who had been abandoned months before could now marry the patriarch of her betrayers. Beatriz anticipated those questions. She addressed them in interviews and public statements, with the same careful language she used in design presentations. "This is not about rescuing myself with status. It is an agreement to reframe influence into accountability." The marriage itself was small and intentional. No grand ballroom, no tableau of charity. It was a legal joining that came with preambles and clauses, not to commodify affection, but to anchor public responsibility. Papers were signed in a public registry with witnesses, and provisions made explicit. Funds would be supervised by an independent board. The Institute's projects would be audited annually by external reviewers. Roberto would abstain from decisions where conflict could be alleged. They required DNA tests and medical clearances where relevant to public legitimacy, and everything was documented and accessible to the auditors. The unusual nature of the union generated headlines and inevitably skepticism, but many also saw it as an act that translated private failure into public repair. The legal machinery continued its work. Felipe was charged and arrested on counts related to embezzlement and misappropriation of funds. The charges were tied directly to the ledgers and digital trails the auditors had uncovered.
Marina faced professional consequences and an ethics hearing that suspended her license. She would later lose her ability to practice independently. Patricia's legal entanglements moved forward, and the family's public image fractured in ways that money could no longer polish. All the while, Beatriz remained clear about her priorities. She did not seek revenge. She sought restitution and the restoration of resources to projects meant for the city's neediest communities. Under her new role, first as a public partner in the Institute, and later in a formal executive position within the restructured company, she leveraged resources to build what she had only dreamed of while sketching behind the paper shop: dignified, affordable housing that respected its residents. The projects came to life in stages. First, a pilot set of modular units that used passive cooling and communal courtyards to encourage pride and safety. She insisted that the units be built with accessible materials, and that a portion of the subcontracting be given to local tradespeople trained through the Institute's apprenticeship program. She walked construction sites wearing dust on her shoes and a face full of purpose, not spectacle. The first keys were handed over to families from neighborhoods like São Mateus, people who, decades earlier, might have only read about such possibilities in glossy magazines. There was opposition along the way, board members who were skeptical of the speed of reform, contractors who balked at tighter oversight, and political actors who wished to reclaim influence. Beatriz navigated these obstacles with the same insistence she had brought to legal proceedings: make the case clearly, produce evidence, and rally public support through demonstrated outcomes. She hosted open site visits, allowed journalists to follow the construction, and made sure every contract, every invoice, every design choice was auditable. Her institute opened its doors to a cohort of young architects and technicians from underrepresented neighborhoods. The curriculum merged hands-on construction with ethics, contract literacy, and community engagement. Students learned not only how to draft plans, but how to read ledgers and protect intellectual property. Beatriz taught some classes herself, often using small, deceptively simple models to explain how tiny design choices can make the difference between dignity and neglect. She watched graduates return to their communities as certified professionals, carrying not just a diploma, but a new language of civic responsibility. The media's tone shifted over time, as the focus moved from scandal to results. Headlines about arrests gave way to features about families moving into homes that worked, and a portrait of a woman who had turned humiliation into public service.
Roberto, for his part, used his network to lobby for legislative improvement in oversight of public contracts. He appeared in hearings, sometimes awkwardly, but always with a statement of contrition and a commitment to structural change. His presence opened doors. Beatriz's stewardship made sure they led somewhere accountable. There were private costs to these victories. The act of cleaning up a network of misuse meant public testimonies and personal reckonings. Marina, once a close friend, became a cautionary figure, forced to face the consequences of choices she had made when ambition outran integrity. Felipe's arrest severed ties that could not be mended by apology alone. Families realigned, trust recalibrated, and the Tavares name, though still weighty, now bore cracks of accountability that had not been visible before. In quieter moments, Beatriz returned to the domestic life she had once envisioned and found it shaped by new realities. She had long kept the satin ring in a drawer. The symbolic artifact had been catalogued and assessed, no longer an object of nostalgia, but part of a past that taught practical lessons. Not long after the Institute's first cohort graduated and the pilot project's residents moved in, Beatriz discovered she was pregnant. The news arrived with the same mixture of uncertainty and wonder that had accompanied every major decision since the chapel, an event that would be both private and inevitably public because of the life she now led. Pregnancy for Beatriz was not a tale of miraculous recovery, nor an emblem of poetic fate. It was a continuation of the ordinary, tender things of life. There were prenatal visits and measured sonograms, quiet evenings when she sketched nursery ideas, and conversations with Roberto about the sort of father he wanted to be this time, more present, less entitled. Their union was not free of questions. The public would watch, critics would whisper about motives, and some would always try to reduce the complexity of their relation to a scandalous line. But their household was genuine in the way of people who had built trust after damage, with agreed boundaries, with explicit mechanisms for fairness, and with a commitment to raising children whose world would be less beholden to dynastic power. Twins came into the world on an ordinary morning. The double arrival was not scripted to repair anything. It simply happened, a private joy that stitched together the family's future. Friends from the Institute, neighbors from São Mateus, and some of the early cohort of apprentices filled the room with meals and hands that knew how to hold a life steady. The twins grew amid models and construction plans, tucked under mobiles shaped like geometric forms. Beatriz watched them with a fierce tenderness and a tired, deep satisfaction. The architecture of her life had room for laughter. Years unfurled with the slow, reliable cadence of work that multiplies into impact.
The initial pilot project expanded into a city program under contract that required transparency measures Beatriz had championed. The Institute's graduates staffed municipal projects and private firms that had committed to ethical procurement practices. Roberto, publicly repentant and privately diligent, fundraised and opened doors. He also learned the rituals of apology and the responsibilities of repair. The Tavares family suffered reputational losses that recalibrated their social position. That was not celebrated by Beatriz. She did not cheer the fall of anyone merely for sport. but it was acknowledged as consequence. Those who had abused influence faced the cost of their choices. Those who cooperated helped redirect resources that had been misused. In a city where power often flattens accountability, the combination of public pressure, legal follow-through, and strategic partnerships had produced a different kind of precedent. Beatriz's institute continued to reach. She traveled to other cities to speak about ethical stewardship of public funds and the role of architects in shaping social justice. Her speeches combined the intimacy of someone who had walked through heartbreak with hard data about roofs that kept families dry and apprenticeship programs that provided pathways out of precarity. She spoke plainly about dignity, about the structural nature of theft, how it is not only about money, but authorship and the social credit that determines who gets to build a city. She called on professionals to reject shortcuts and on institutions to adopt transparent processes. At home, life softened into ordinary rituals that felt, after years of tumult, hard-won. There were school recitals where Beatriz sat in the back with a folded notebook and a proud private smile. There were dinners where the children, later joined by new siblings, asked blunt questions about their origins and about a grandmother who had been treated for a mental condition. The family answered as best they could, truth, compassion, and an acknowledgement that history is complex. On anniversaries that once would have been measured by dresses and expectation, Beatriz preferred simple markers, a plaque at the first housing site naming the families who had moved in, a scholarship in her parents' name, a mural painted by institute graduates. She inaugurated the institute's second campus in a neighborhood that had once produced her. The ribbon cutting was modest, with an emphasis on the people who would work there rather than on the celebrity of its leadership. There were critics who argued that marrying Roberto complicated narratives of power. Beatriz listened and engaged with some, explaining the reasons behind her choices, a desire to reframe influence, to bind privilege to public oversight, and to create legal mechanisms that would make restitution durable. She did not romanticize the marriage. She described it as one element among many through which a wrong might be made right.
People continued to debate whether that was enough. She welcomed the debate. Public discourse, she believed, was part of the architecture of accountability. Years later, as the Institute graduated its 20th cohort and the housing initiatives became models replicated in other cities, Beatriz found herself walking through a garden she had helped design on a sore spot of formerly abandoned land. Children chased each other between low planters, and an old woman from a nearby block sat knitting on a bench. The city hummed, and in its quieter pockets, the work had changed lives. She stood then for a long minute, hands in her pockets, looking at the small cluster of homes that had once been a line on a tracing paper. The twins, now taller, ran past and vaulted themselves onto a low wall. Roberto passed her with a cup of coffee and, without theatrics, took her hand. There was no grand speech. There was simply a small, unremarkable contentment that followed long work and hard decisions. If there was moral in that contentment, it was not one of simple retribution. It was the conviction that dignity can be rebuilt and that power can be repurposed when put under public guardrails. Beatriz had not sought to destroy those who had wronged her. She had sought to create systems that prevented such wrongs and remade stolen assets into shared goods. Her life had been caught in betrayal once, in a moment that became an image across many screens, but then it was architected into restitution. In the last scenes of the public life that once defined her, she spoke at a modest ceremony where graduates of the Institute returned to teach a new class. Her remarks were short and precise, like the annotations she once made in the margins of designs.
The shop had new owners from the old neighborhood, and a child peered in, eyes wide. Beatriz stopped and, without fanfare, stepped inside. She bought a single sheet of the same sturdy paper she had once learned to handle, tucked it into her bag, and left a note for the shopkeeper thanking them for what they had taught her. As the lights of the city blurred at dusk and the sound of distant traffic stitched itself into the evening, Beatriz sat for a moment with her family at the table. The twins argued over a model car. Roberto joked about a contractor's estimates. The twins' laughter filled a room that, years earlier, had known a very different chord. The record of what had happened, the betrayals, the audits, the legal consequences, remained in files and public records. But at that table something else had been restored, the ordinary discipline of caring for one another. The story that began with a runaway at an altar had moved, through diligence and choice, into a broader narrative of restitution and rebuilding. Beatriz did not pretend the path had been easy or the outcomes perfect. She acknowledged the moral complexities and the cost of trusting again. She had been betrayed in the most public way possible, and she chose not to collapse under it, but to convert the force of that collapse into scaffolding for others. In the quiet final image, she stood in a garden she had helped design, children's voices mingling with the distant city, and the modest homes rising like proof of what can be done when skill meets accountability.
She kept a small stack of tracing paper near her desk, reminders that plans can be redrawn, that errors can be corrected, and that dignity is both a design choice and a daily practice. If this story moved you, leave a comment. What would you have done in Beatriz's place? Share this story with someone who believes in rebuilding, and subscribe to follow more narratives where integrity meets the messy work of change.